Mobile hunters, our buddies over at Tethered are always innovating to keep us more mobile and in the game when it counts. From the Tethered One Sticks, the Fast Pack, to the Ultra Lock saddle, Tethered is always designing to increase comfort and utility while reducing bulk, weight, and fiddle factor of mobile hunting gear. And now, they've outdone themselves yet again by creating the carbon fiber forged Predator CFX platform, the latest fully featured mobile saddle platform that raises the bar for what's possible in mobile hunting gear. Whether you're new to saddle hunting or an old tree climbing veteran, go to tetherednation.com for all your saddle hunting gear. All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of the Truth from a Stand Deer Hunting Podcast. And today I got on my good buddy, Mr. Mario Trafficante. Look, my pronunciation is getting better every time, dude.
It is. More authentic.
Right? I'll start doing this as we go. And just so you know, since the last time we spoke, I have spent a little time at a very awesome local, authentic Italian market that we have in my neighborhood. Not in my neighborhood, but just in like the town that I live in. So
very nice.
They got all the good stuff. They got a bunch of really good wine. Went and did a wine tasting there with my wife. A lot of good food. They prepare their own pastas. You know, so maybe if you venture to this into this neck of the woods one day, maybe I'll take you there and we can share a glass of red and maybe like a good prosciutto.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah. My mom, ironically, is actually my mom lives with us. She's making meatballs today, so we got all the preparations out for that. So she's gonna partake in doing that, so we can stockpile some of those. We'll cook some of them up, then freeze some of the rest, so we have it for use.
Meatballs are my weakness. My mom, now my mom's not Italian, but she is often requested to make her meatballs for any occasion. So they came down right before Christmas,
sure.
And since they were coming down, we were going out to dinner like that night. We don't do gifts with them. They just usually visit, and then we'll all go out to dinner and have like a nice dinner together. And so, so we had just charcuterie snacks and stuff like that during the course of the day. And my mom's always like, "Do you want me to bring anything?" And we're like, "Meatballs. Bring the meatballs.
Bring your meatballs."
Yes. Yeah. I could just pound those things down, man. But how was your Christmas?
It was good.
Yeah.
Pretty laid back. My oldest daughter was back from school. So we had a small number of family members that came by to the house. We actually do, food-wise, we do like raclette, which is a Swiss tradition because my wife is family's from Switzerland, which you cook all your own food on a small like flat grill in front of you, and there's like various cheeses and vegetables, and I usually slice up venison, so I cut up some of the venison that I had this year to cook for that. Nice. So we did that. So it was nice and relaxed. So
nice. Big plans for the new year. You guys, you're probably like me, man. It's like I stay in. I don't go anywhere. I barely make it. I barely make it to midnight.
I know our days of like going out and doing any of that. I mean, our youngest daughter is 14, so
right.
And my mom's here with us. We'll stay in and kind of do whatever, play some games, board games, keep it pretty chill.
Yeah, nice. Our tradition is we do fondue every New Year's Eve.
Sure.
That's like our thing.
Cheese fondue?
Yeah. I don't even know where. Yeah, I don't even know where it came from. I think we did it once whenever my daughter was really young. Mm-hmm. What kid doesn't like a thing of like melted cheese? You know what I mean? So that just kind of became like the thing that we do every New Year's Eve now.
So do you mix a number of cheeses together, and then do you mix like egg in it and all that? Because again, cheese fondue is German, Swiss kind of heritage. So my wife's family has done that before. There's like if I remember correctly, the alcohol that's with that. Well, obviously the adults drink with that as like Kirsch, right. I think it is, but it's
okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, I had to endure some cheese fondue dinners when I first met my wife.
So
they kept handing me shots of that, which
right. I do dig the fondue, and I think where it really started, we actually have a fondue cookbook.
Okay.
Because when my wife and I were much younger, like in even when we were engaged and like right as we got married, as many young couples are, you don't have a lot, right? And so you try to figure out ways to have like, enjoyable times that don't cost a lot of money and stuff like that. And this was, so fondue was like a way for us to have like a like what we would deem like a fancy meal that didn't cost us a whole lot of money to either make. It was also like at the same time the craze of like Colorado fondue like popped up, like the restaurant, and there were a couple other ones that were similar to that were like fondue style restaurants, and so we ended up getting like a fondue cookbook at some point. And so there's a handful of them that are in there that we like, that we usually make every year when we're going to do fondue. So that's kind of how fondue came about for us. It was the youngsters in us trying to have like a fancy, cheap, have a caviar experience on a Miller High Life budget, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah,
so are you, I don't take you for much of like a New Year's resolution guy, but do you do New Year's resolutions at all? I'm always interested if people actually do those or not.
I don't really. I mean,
no,
I'm very, I guess I'm very, I would say, systematic and just sort of scheduled in what I need to do day to day. I mean, obviously during the holiday season, I mean, I've been, into working out and into nutrition, so maintaining what I eat and everything like that is pretty standard throughout my daily practice. But during the holidays, there's always a significant amount of cookies and everything else that's around the house from things that we made. So it's like cleansing the body away from all that stuff as the post-holiday. But it's been, over the holiday this year because I've been working out with wrestling and doing more of that stuff. So that really hasn't, it's not like you're sitting around all day. There's always plenty of stuff to do. So.
Yeah. It's not like you're not active, but I feel your pain there because every year, I'm always like, I try to manage it, right? Because I'm similar to you, to where it's like I try to eat really well and work out and stuff like that. And the holiday season, like your schedule gets thrown off because there's family events, there's just things you have to go do and that you want to go do. I shouldn't say you have to go do, right? Because I do like spending time with family and stuff. But it kind of throws off your schedule, and there's not always the best food choices around you and things like that, right? And so I just kind of go like, you know what, these like 2 weeks, I'm gonna enjoy whatever is being enjoyed, and I'm going to do that. I'm going to work out as often as I can. But in the back of my mind, I'm always like, I feel worse. You know what I mean? Like, so I was off for a couple of days and I actually went to the gym yesterday and rolled for the first time in like 3 or 4 days because we were traveling back home to see family and stuff like that. And it just felt good to like go get tired. You know what I mean? Like to get back on the mat and just sweat it out. And it's funny how quickly like you start to feel normal again. Right. Cause like I'm eating like some bad food and stuff like that for like, 2-week period of time. And I miss a couple of days of training. And then I get back to training again. And in my mind, I'm like, oh, this is going to be terrible. I feel like I've lost a lot. Right. But it's weird in a weird way. What I lost in maybe like a little bit of cardio, I actually gained in like mental freshness, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Cause you're not burnt out with it. Yeah, it is interesting at the end of the year. I mean, I do quite a bit of self-reflection, but not only against things that I attempted to accomplish, but just how I want potentially the year to play out next year. I mean, you can put that in the context of your hunting, your work, your family, and all that, just to kind of assess, like, did that go how I planned it? How were things physically, emotionally, stress levels? I would say my life now, with the age that my kids are and running a business, working a job, it's like that balance and that dynamic that happens, especially during, we're going to talk about the hunting season and how that schedule plays out with getting out to hunt. That's the stuff I more or less assess at a macro level, and then kind of look at, all right, how do I want that to play out differently next year? What things do I need to actually go about changing in order to make that schedule a little more palatable? Again, it could be to spend more time with family. It could be to focus more on things that I have to do at work, or it could be to, be able to break away and get into the outdoors. I find a similar thing with that time, at least for me, the time I get to spend completely immersed in the outdoors. Um, when I'm going out and doing it every day for several hours and getting that in an extended period of time, I mean, I might, fortunate enough in some cases to do that sometimes for the greater period of a month or more. And I'm specifically talking about bow hunting and deer hunting and getting out and just immersing yourself in that whole process. Um, it is weird when you wean yourself back off of that and you have to sort of integrate back into this digital life where, I work in an office and I'm in front of computer screens and um, you're
Yeah.
constantly getting notifications. You definitely begin to realize how much, innately those of us that participate in this are more like hunter-gatherer mindset. Like we want to be out in that environment, and you miss that, and it pulls you to it. So even in the morning and things, if you could just get out and get some time in the outdoors before you have to be inside all the time
Yeah.
and in a digital environment, it helps a lot. But
Yeah. Even just getting up and going for a walk. It's like I've tried to do that, because I'm the same way. When I get back, when hunting season's kind of over and my extensive outdoor time is kind of nipped, right? I start to go a little stir crazy. I need to have a reintroduction period almost, to where it's like I gradually work myself back into, my normal life, if you will. And I would start walking the dog in the morning, because usually I get up, get a workout in, and, let the dog out, feed him and stuff like that. But then I started kind of taking advantage of, taking the dog out for a walk. I'll maybe throw a pack on like a ruck to kind of get ready for a Western trip,
Yep.
and carry some weight. And it's only like a mile loop or whatever. But it's something, it's amazing what that mile loop will kind of do for you, And then just thinking about reflection, this year was really weird for me because it was almost a little opposite, where like the past several seasons, I had basically, screwed up some hunts, et cetera, to where I was basically burning the oil all the way through, my season around here ends like the very end of January. Right. And so I was burning the oil for the past like 3 seasons all the way up to the very end of the season and didn't fill like a buck tag, filled a couple doe tags or whatever, but just had a buck tag still in my pocket. Right. And so the family not paid the price, right, but like paid the price in the sense of like I was gone every, chance I had to get out to the woods. I was gone, right? And this year was different, to where I was joking with our mutual buddy Chad Sylvester. I was joking with him. I was like, I had 5 hunts this year. I was like, and filled 2 tags. You know what I mean? I was like, I literally hunted 5 days. That was it. Now I did some other scouting and stuff like that, but like as far as like a bow in my hand and actually out hunting, it was 5 days. And some people would say, well, you could have been out more, right? And certainly I could have, but there was also that part of me that you were kind of talking about, reflecting and like balance that we've talked about in the past, where I feel like part of the reason why I maybe was as efficient as I was this year was because I actually had real balance. Like I was so out of balance before, that this year was actually the first year that I kind of had balance, where in my off season, it's like I did some scouting, but I also prioritized spending time with my family, prioritized, working out, being healthy, training jiu-jitsu. And so I just felt like this year I had a better kind of systematic approach to how I was going to kind of tackle the season and how I was kind of like planning and mapping my life, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I'm interested to hear what changes you made, because I think it's part of that whole concept that you get into of wanting success in your hunts, in your life, versus needing it, like thinking you actually need it to exist. And I think everyone, we get caught in that trap, because I've been in that situation too, where we're in the same boat. Like you can hunt all the way, there's counties here that you can hunt all the way through the end of January, and I've been in that position. And it's funny, there were some pictures popping up on one of the Alexas that we have, was me sitting in a tree stand, because during this time of the year, like in previous years, it's funny because if I didn't fill a tag, I would be out hunting during this time. And so yeah, our families do experience that they kind of take a hit for that, right, when you're unbalanced and you're moving in those. So those are definitely, it's interesting. Those are sort of the things that you think about on how you want to reschedule or change really with hunting. I think it becomes changing your scouting strategy and changing how you're locating these bucks
Yeah.
in the off season.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I think the
yeah,
biggest
so
thing.
I'm curious, like what did you do different
Yeah.
with that
Yeah.
early season buck, to change that paradigm for you?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing for me was, I was kind of forced into it last offseason. We had some family stuff kind of pop up to where I just wasn't able to spend as much time scouting. I was able to do some, not nearly as much as I had done in the years past. But I think what it forced me to do was what I should have been doing a lot more. And I think this is something I'm going to just adopt just in general going forward, was kind of like at the high level, I guess, is that relying way more on historical information and less on like real-time data. Like, so, I don't target a specific buck usually, because I usually don't have a buck like year over year that I can find or follow from year to year to year. So the real time data for me isn't critical because I'm not going after a specific animal. It's more about just understanding how the animals in the area are going to use the landscape and how the food sources might have changed. Like, that's really like the real time stuff for me. It's not what buck is here. And so that was probably the biggest thing, was just more so relying on all the things that I know and not over rotating too much on that one piece of data that I got October 7th, and allowing one piece of information to unravel all the stuff that I've known for 3 years to be true, And I think a lot of guys get into that because that piece of data might be a little bit of confirmation bias, because it might tell them the thing that they want to be told, as opposed to like this mountain of data or intel that you already have over the course of 3 years is really telling you the truth, right? And that one piece of data is lying to you, So that was kind of like that was a big thing for me this year. And what it really did for me was allowed me to just kind of hunt free. Like, I hunted completely unattached to areas and things of that nature, right? And I just felt like I was hunting more and more in the moment. So even though I'm not using real-time intel, I'm basically making decisions based off of what I see, which brings me to the next point, which was, and this is a thing that I learned in Kansas. So as much as I was implementing some of this stuff this year, I was also learning a lot about how I think I'm probably going to hunt going forward, or how I'm just maybe I'm just evolving as a hunter potentially.
Right.
But relying on the visual, trying to get a visual of an animal, was how I killed that buck in Kansas. And it's funny because I mentioned this in a podcast I did with Jake on the Exodus podcast, because I mentioned Joe Rentmeester, our mutual buddy. And he and I were doing a show one day, and I said to him that after we got done, I asked him, do you think you're a really visual hunter? And he said, no, not really. And I was like, that's odd. I was like, because every deer you just told me about you killing, I was like, you had a visual before you killed it. And he was like, whoa, wait a minute. He's like, yeah. He's like, I never thought of it that way. And I was like, yeah. I was like, almost every deer you told me about. I was like, I was like, it struck me as odd because you're hunting swamps and wooded areas, and stuff like that. I was like, but it reminds me a lot of how someone would hunt the plain states. I was like, where you see that buck one time. I was like, and that's all you need. And then that deer's days are usually numbered at that point, and you do it differently where we live or where you live, right? It's like you can shine or whatever and get that visual, right? Or maybe it's an observation sit or whatever. But so that really is kind of how things changed for me. And so that early October hunt was a spot that I had known of for 3 years, had scouted it, had run trail cameras in that general area. And I knew that there's an early doe that comes in there because I saw the fawn drop. And so it was just basically long-term data on that spot. And I knew that there'd be a 3-day window between like the 16th to the 18th, 16th to the 19th. 3 days within like that 4 to 5 day span is going to be the best day, because it has been year over year. And so I just got the right wind on the 16th and went in, kayaked in, and that deer was dead by 7:15 that morning, and it was just a spot that I knew every year I've gone in there on the 15th, 16th, 17th, up until the 18th. And the past 2 years prior, it was the 18th, both years back to back. I had an encounter with a shooter in that spot. And so I knew if I was in there and I played my cards right and I stayed out and don't put any pressure on it and I just let it do what it's going to do, it'll get right. And I just need to time, as long as I time it correctly and wait for the right wind, that would be that would be my best chance. And so I did, and it was literally, I was in the. It was one of those things where it's a tree I've been in before, and I maybe was going to go to a different tree, and I didn't. And because I had picked a different tree out when I scouted it in the off season, it was one of those things, and I actually reverted back to where the tree I'm usually in, and got into that one. And if I wouldn't have, I would have never killed that deer. And just, and it worked out this year. And so it was just long-term data on that hunt.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of points that you brought up there. The first one being hunting areas versus specific bucks. I think that's one of the things that maybe new hunters or people get caught up in, because a lot of what we hear about is going down and hunting specific animals. There's people have a ton of trail cam pictures, and they're like, I'm tracking this buck year over year. I would say in general that's difficult for me to do as well. Now I can sort of lie to myself and say, well, I've got this buck on camera from last year. He's showing up in this area on camera this year. But the general areas of where those are make that a little bit more difficult to hone in. Sometimes those bucks move in and out of those areas, and they don't necessarily stay in there. Now, I have seen that on public land where the specific animals, like you can hunt them year over year over year. But I would say in general, my schedule now falls more into where learning these specific areas and the pattern of movement that the deer use in specific timing of the year, and then capitalizing on that, and then having multiple areas that I begin to understand that. Now, again, through time, I don't have enough time to go out and get dozens and dozens of these places like that where, okay, so I understand the topography of the place that I'm hunting, like how I access it, how I set it up based on wind, weather, time of year, and then also know that there is a mature animal or the potential for a mature animal to move in and out of there. So there's a certain amount of those areas that I could scout myself. And then I think this is a key component. Like I have friends that are willing to, like we co-share, like, so we'll have areas that we'll scout independently, or each of us have access to hunt, and then we'll share that information to capitalize. And then as the year goes on, depending on how each person's success is, you're able to bounce those ideas off of each other to go after bucks that are in the area,
I think I think what you said with having buddies that you can share information with is critical, especially if you're breaking down, larger tracts of land. I got a couple of buddies that I hunt and scout that the North Piece with, and, two of the guys actually live in that general area. So hunting and scouting with them has expedited my learning curve on that piece, exponentially. If it weren't for them, I would still probably be scratching my head a little bit just because it's a hard spot to hunt. And we also share trail camera intel. Like,
right.
If they walk, I always tell them, like, if you walk by one of my trail cameras, like I send them like all the locations of my trail cameras. And I'm like, if you walk by one, because it's it's like 2 hours from my house. So I'm not there all the time. I can only really get there to hunt at certain times and to scout at certain times. I just tell them, check the camera. If you have an extra card, swap the card. Just send me anything that's good on the camera, so we're all kind of in the know. And otherwise, like, feel free to check it, because I want them to kill something as badly as I want to kill something, so, and maybe if they kill something, we all figure something out from that, is kind of the idea. But, I think for me, using and understanding, I think the reason why I start to lean more toward long-term data and just understanding spots, and like to your point, it's like I don't have 12 of them. I got a couple that I know really well, and I kind of know the ebbs and flows of it, is that it takes a lot longer for the landscape and habitat to change than it does for the deer to change, right? That deer, if you're on one deer, it could be in a spot, and then that he's there, or that you think you do, and then a coyote bumps him, and now he's not there any longer, right? Or the day that you're going to hunt, right? Or it's gotten a ton of pressure from other people that you can't control, right? But if the landscape is right and the habitat is right, you can predict how the deer are going to use it, then that deer may not be there that you've been watching or whatever, but there might be another one, another mature deer that's in that area that's going to use it the same way, right? And so that's kind of my thinking, is just the landscape and habitat is way more predictable year to year to year for me, and it changes over time, certainly. Acorn crop changes how it drops and stuff like that. But by and large, I'm going to have a lot longer runway with that habitat being consistent than I am on that deer being consistent.
Yeah, I agree. And especially when you're doing patterns of behavior that are in those areas in any time of the year. So it's going to, if you're focusing on an early season pattern and that they use a specific land area like this in the early season, for me, it's typically because of a specific food source. A lot of times that's acorns, but it also has to do with because this has changed. How is the adjacent bedding? Like, how is the foliage growing up in the summer months? What is the tree cover change like? Because we've had some pretty significant changes with that, with the ash die-off and the growing of buckthorn. That's changed bedding areas and changed access areas or staging areas that the deer use to get to that food, which is, I've had spots where I knew how they were using it, let's say over a 2 to 3 year period, and then slowly, as there was all this mature tree die off and those trees started to fall, then the bedding areas that were primarily ash, right? So they had heavy tree cover. Well, that started returning back to cattails, returning back to swamp grass, and then you had other areas that transitioned in between that became like these very thick, dense kind of buckthorn forests, which presented this whole other challenge of trying to hunt those deer as they were moving from bedding to high ground or bedding to food. Because now, as a hunter, in some cases, I don't necessarily have trees that I can sit in to access where they're bedding or close to where they're bedding. So I had to change things up.
Right.
And
yeah, you have to start to change your strategy a little bit, right? Or at least, like, maybe not sometimes your strategy, but certainly your tactics, right? Like, so, because I know the buck you killed this year was on the ground. I've hunted some on the ground in Pennsylvania, and I certainly was while I was out, in Kansas. And I think that was one of the things that, I kind of changed over time as well. That, if I reflect back, and not just this year, but I think one of the best things I've done over the past couple years was actually force myself to hunt from the ground exclusively in situations, just for no other reason than to get better at it. Because I think there's so many opportunities that you might have that there's not a tree, right? Like there's, or you get confident in. So the example, I had a deer that I should have killed last year that I didn't, and what kept him alive was my apprehension to actually get out of my tree and stalk him, because he was 40 yards from me. I had the right wind. It was super windy, so I could get in and out of the tree if I needed to, quiet enough, and make a move on that deer. And I just sat there and was like hoping he would get up out of that bed and come check that scrape, right? And the reality is like he had the wind blowing across that scrape to where he was sent checking that scrape where he was laying, so he wasn't going to get up and check that scrape. And I kind of realized that about into hour 2 that he was sitting there laying there while I was watching him, Yeah. and like, had I just been a little bit more confident in my ground skills, it's like I would have just got out of the tree, quietly, and then made a move on him, right? And I think that I think just being hunting multiple habitat types, hunting different types of approaches, from like a setup standpoint, is something that, not just this year, but over time in general, I have started to add in, which also played out whenever I got to Kansas this year, because that was that kind of forced discomfort for a couple seasons and screwing stuff up on the ground is what ultimately led to killing that deer.
Yeah. Yeah. And that ties into just breaking our habits of our mindset where we've had success in the past. If your success is primarily, you're going in and hanging and hunting, or for people, if you're in a permanent stand and you're sitting in that stand and every year during the same amount of time, a mature animal walks by and you're used to that pattern, it's very difficult to break that habit when you start not having success with it, because everything in your mind and physically in your body is telling you, well, I'm out here hunting. I've done this before, and this is what's been proven success for me. But I think when you're out in the elements and you really, you immerse yourself in it when you're out doing it every day. Speaking of, if we were hunter gatherers every single day, you'd gain a certain innate instinct. Like the guys that, if you're putting more hours out in the woods and you're putting more hours practicing it, there's a certain just innate instinct that you get. It's a rhythm. It's the same as practicing jiu-jitsu or wrestling or any sort of martial arts. You get this instinct. Well, it's no different with hunting. So I think one of the things is, if your time is limited, remember that you do have to kind of break the norm. Remember, you are hunting an animal and you're in this open environment, and it has patterns that it's following. You have patterns that you're following, but to your point, when you're in the moment, you're going to need to make adjustments. And that adjustment might be, get down on the ground and stalk it, or take a different route in that you didn't have planned in your head when you were walking in there, right? Because you saw something. I thought about that a lot this year too. The ability to actually see an animal on hoof. And maybe part of this is just because, there's a lot of conversation about use of trail cameras and how they're an advantage, but then they're, can be a hindrance, because depending on where you have them, they draw you in. You make this assumption that, well, I'm not seeing deer maybe on this camera, so those deer aren't in the area, right? And this is probably going to be an obvious statement that others have experienced, but I literally observed, one of my cameras, because I was sitting in a just off spot, and I watched all the deer, and I know this was because of my access. I watched them all walk around and avoid that camera. So literally, deer after deer after deer, which it's like, well, okay, you should have the camera in a better spot. Well, traditionally, that non-disruptive spot that I had placed that camera in years prior would give me all the intel I needed. But now, for whatever reason, the pressure, the change in topography, when I sat one night, I observed where that camera was, and I watched all the deer traverse across this little island coming out of bedding and completely walk a different direction and avoid that camera. Now, they were still reaching the same end place, but again, if there's a mature animal and I'm using that camera to get intel on whether or not they're crossing that island, I'm thinking, if I'm just basing it on my camera intel, that animal's not there. So that's something for people to think about too. Maybe getting a little bit into the weeds on it, but the things that I've experienced is like, okay, you place a camera. I'm placing that specifically for the purpose of gathering intel on that really niche spot that I don't want to go into until the wind and everything is specifically right, and potentially knowing that that animal that I'm after is there, or there is an animal moving through there at that time. So when I go in there, I know that essentially I'm burning that spot or I'm disrupting it. So I think over time, where you place those cameras, even if you've had success with it in the past or you've had success hunting in it, that obviously changes. 1 year, you might get the same pattern for a couple of years, but then it's going to change, and they're going to start figuring you out. They're going to start figuring out how you've been successful, and that whole paradigm is going to shift. So your existing property that you thought you knew real well, with just a little too much pressure, you've now changed how those animals use it.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting, man. Like, the one thing that popped into my mind as you were kind of saying that was, and this is something that I think that it's something I guess I've kind of maybe was pondering, if you will, right? And it became much more apparent, I think, whenever I was out on that Kansas hunt. And it was the idea that we don't know these deer nearly as well as we think that we do until we finally get a visual. That was like whenever it was a slam dunk for me. When I could observe them do something one time, because to your point, that kind of illuminates their pattern to a degree, right? And for me out there, it was the bucks bedding more consistently and more predictable during certain parts of the rut than earlier in the year, right? Bedding close to does and following a doe and how the mature, buck will behave during that time of year. And the other thing that you said that I wrote it down because I thought it was it made me think of this idea when you were saying that, we're on a pattern and they're on a pattern, right? And if we're ships continually passing in the night, then it stands to reason one of us needs to break the pattern for that deer to be killed. They either need to make a mistake, right? Or revert back to the pattern that I'm expecting, or I need to change my pattern to interrupt their behavior, right? And it's more likely that I can change because I can't change the deer and I can't anticipate when he's going to change necessarily. Maybe if a weather front comes in or food source changes or there's a wind shift or something like that, right? But you have to have a pretty innate, or not innate, but you have to have a pretty deep understanding or intimate, I guess, understanding of a specific deer to kind of play that game, if you will. And so it's more to my advantage if I'm willing to change than expecting the deer to change, right? And so, with that in mind, when we're talking about, falling in love with spots or expecting the same patterns to continually play out, how do you not get caught in that rut, or into that trap, right? Because I think we've all done it. I think we've all done it unknowingly, and I think we've all done it knowingly, where it's I've gone back to a spot because I've had past success, and I want it to happen there again because the way this, it just feels right. But everything is telling me academically that this is the wrong spot, or this spot has now dried up and you need to shift. Maybe it's only 50 yards or whatever the case is, right? But you kind of fall in love with that one tree or that one setup or whatever. So how do you stay kind of open to the possibility of, abandoning a place that has been really good to you over time?
Yeah, I think, and it's hard. It's hard when you continue to be successful in an area. The last 2 bucks that I killed back to back were within a quarter mile of each other in areas where I observe during that time of the year, a lot of other bucks use that similar pattern in that area. And I know that area really well. So then it gets you in your mind next year thinking during that same time of the year, I'm going to be in there and the same pattern is going to play out. I think honestly, for one's success, like anything in life, can be incredibly dangerous towards your success, right? Because you're really relying on the fact that none of those other factors are going to change, and there's going to be another mature animal in there, and the topography, the way they use the land, all that's going to stay consistent. The food, the pressure, right? So what I try to remind myself of is undoubtedly one of those things are going to change. Food sources are going to change. Pressure from other hunters or people are going to change. The land is going to gradually change over time. And there's no guarantee on what animals are actually going to be there. As much as I try to scout and figure out and observe, in my case, I realize that I don't have enough time to, as you talked about, you talked about really understanding how a specific buck is moving in and out. The guys that I have in my friends group that do that, they're spending a lot of time not only analyzing trail cam data, but boots on the ground during all parts of the season, right now, back walking tracks, looking how deer are behaving to really figure out hey, I'm tagged out for the year already, with bow and gun, they're saying to themselves, but I'm now trying to figure out what these up and comer bucks are doing for next year. I know guys like that. So that's a different game that they're playing. I think for a lot of us, if you have a busier work and family schedule, you need to force yourself to go adventure into new spots. And the last time we talked, I talked about this where this past year I added another spot that's kind of in central Wisconsin, which is near where I grew up, but it's an area where I didn't hunt. So I hunted that. I scouted it the year prior, never got out there to hunt, scouted it again in the summer last year, and then went and hunted it twice this year. It didn't bear any fruit. I had 2 sits out there. I didn't see any deer. I ran into other hunters, but so I forced myself to do that. 2 things that it does. It forces me to learn and pick up other tactics because I'm going into a new area that might be similar in topography, but it's still a new area that I'm not comfortable with. So it forces me to think differently. It forces me to explore, right? I actually become a better hunter because of that. And I think, I always add 2 or 3 of those spots a year. Now, again, some of those are coming from my friends who are saying, "Hey, I've been on this location. Go try this area. See what you think. I want your opinion on it. You go in there and scout and see what it looks like and hunt it." To be honest, a lot of those swings at bat are, they can be duds. They don't always
Right.
bear fruit. But the benefit of it is that I learned something with each one of those hunts. And it gives me more confidence because I am going to other areas and seeing deer move in different situations. Because typically, if I'm hunting a lot of swamps and lowland areas around where I live, within an hour or so from where I live, if I go north in Wisconsin or I go out west, then I'm getting and hunting more hill country spots, right? Or more farmland spots. And that presents different movement patterns. I'm seeing deer do different things. And for me, I want to see that. I want to see how they're interacting and moving in different areas. And then the other factor that does, when one of those areas gets hot during a different time of the year, I've already had experience accessing it. I've already had experience exiting it. I've already had 1 or 2 setups in these. If you do this over multiple years, it will end up being multiple locations. You might not visit every area each year, but you'll have experience going in there, setting up, seeing what it looks like from stand. I think those factors are really important if you're trying to set up and kill, especially when you're reading sign and trying to kill something on the fly, because it's gotten hot during the year. You got a tip that you got to go in there, or there's you've noticed there's a mature animal moving in there. So for me,
Right.
it's like forced discipline.
Right.
Don't get too comfortable.
Right.
It's kind of think about your workouts.
Yeah.
You make a lot of gains in your workouts when you're first starting out and you changed it up and everything. And then there reaches a certain point where it's like, hey, you're going in every day and you're working out and you feel good and fine, but you're not really getting out of it what, you did originally, because your body has gotten used to it. I think hunting and the patterns that we form there are no different.
Yeah. You have to create a little confusion with yourself to kind of re-problem solve, if you will. Like the one thing I was thinking of was, as you were kind of talking about, a spot's really good, and so you maybe kind of fall in love with it, and it can be dangerous to kind of like not change up your pattern. And I was thinking that sometimes that's a great place to start. It's like if you're wrestling or you're doing jiu-jitsu or whatever, and you have your A game, and you can always go to your A game and it's really good, but eventually you're going to come up against competition that's better than maybe what you've been competing against, that your A game is no longer going to be good enough, right? And so then what do you go from there? I was kind of thinking of it the same way, where it's like you need to almost be able to grab another gear, right? Like you need to have something else to kind of keep people off the mark a little bit. And to me, it's the same thing in hunting. It's like you can always kind of go to that one location as a starting spot of like, I'm really familiar with this area. Let me throw a hunt at it. Let me see what's going on. And maybe it works out, and great if it does. But if it doesn't, then you go, okay, I need to go to my B game, my C game, my D game, whatever it is. And it might be in that general area, or it might be abandoning that spot completely, going to a whole new area. But it's just that idea of like, it might be a great kind of foundation to kind of start from. And then from there, you make your plan from there. And then as you were kind of talking about it, having spots within a spot, right? So you might have like over time, I think it's the one thing people, maybe if they're newer in hunting that they, are challenged with, is that they'll hear people talk about this stuff and they feel like I've got to have 5 spots like within an area, right? Like right away. And it's like, well, no, it's like it can take years of hunting a spot, scouting a spot. And when I say a spot, it could be any number of acreage, right? It could be a large acreage, it could be small acreage, whatever it happens, whatever that spot entails for that particular area. And it might take 3-4 seasons until you have a couple places that you are confident in to be able to kind of jump between and use. And so if you have spot A and it doesn't work, it's just like troubleshooting. Like if you're a mechanic, or an electrician and something breaks, and it's like you can listen to the car run and go like, well, it might be this because of the sound that it's making. But you ultimately have like a list of things you're probably going to go through to troubleshoot what that is. To me, hunting spots are kind of the same thing. You're just troubleshooting where the deer are at. And so if you have those other spots to go to, that becomes your troubleshooting, right? Because you're like, okay, I'm in spot A and it's not working. Well, what was the draw to spot A? Okay, so maybe that was like a food dependent draw, right? Maybe it was like, hey, there's a white oak here, and like, look, this white oak isn't producing this year. Okay, so what time of year is it? Will kind of help determine like what other spot might be viable, right? And so it's like, okay, well, it's early part of the season. It's going to be food driven. I'm going to go to this spot because I know that there was another, food source in the timber in this area, right? And so you just kind of follow a path of logic of like what spot should be the next best spot based on what the deer need for that time of year. And that's where having like those multiple spots becomes a gold mine. And what you should really kind of strive to do every off season is add, every off season and season is kind of qualify those areas and understand what the value of them are.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like everything that you brought up, and I think, coming full circle back, that's why if you have the time to spending scouting time and going back to actually visually seeing those deer. So, when you get into an area, and we're all used to chasing after and finding beds. When you find a bedding area and you find a bedding area that looks like it has very mature signs. So for me, again, there's a lot of philosophy around what you see for rubs depending on competition and whatnot, but there's mature rubs there. Then you're starting to think about, well, when is this deer using it at what time of the year? There's very worn down beds in multiple locations, kind of in a tight proximity. So it's an area that, you have at least one mature deer that's frequenting and living there a lot. And then you start to see the trails coming in and out of that area and how they're using it. And you start thinking about why. Well, I mean, the golden, the crown jewel after that is like, I want to actually get eyes on this thing coming in and out of this area. And obviously you can use cameras to do that. But back to your original point that you brought up about seeing a physical deer move in and out of a spot or traverse through a spot, there is something different about that when you actually see how they use it on hoof. And that makes them significantly more killable. And part of it might just be the excitement of, okay, it's actually real now. Because I've had deer on camera and I know the bedding areas that are around them, and they showed up on this camera, and I'm like, well, I can go in there and, I'm fairly confident if I set up like this, I'm going to see that deer. And I go in there and everything seems right, and that deer does not show. He doesn't show up.
Right.
And that happens. Yeah. That happens a lot, right?
Yeah.
And then it really gets you thinking, like, man, there is a piece of this, obviously, that I'm missing. And then a lot of times I always come up against, well, the range of this deer probably is more north than my position, and I can only access from the south. And if I come in from this other direction, like I am, that thing, even though it seems like the wind and my access and everything is right, it knows I'm there. Or it could be a simple fact that I cannot hunt 6 days a week bouncing in proximity or sitting way off and observing in proximity to actually see what that animal's doing. So I think there are factors there, right?
Yeah.
Depending on what your availability is.
I think that's why the visuals.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, because if I could spend a large amount of time, like those 6 days, and I would plan that out saying, okay, I'm going to try to get visual confirmation before I slide in or before I make a bigger aggressive move, that allows you some different variables than if, okay, I've got 2 days, I got some camera intel, I pre-scouted this, and I got to go in and I got to take my swing at that. Your expectation of results should be different in those.
Right. Yeah, and that's why I always say on hunting trips, I always kind of joke, I'm a way better hunter whenever I'm traveling than I am at home. And part of it's because I feel like whenever I'm traveling, I'm what I kind of refer to as patiently aggressive. Like I will wait until I get the confirmation I need. And then once I get the confirmation I need, then I push all the chips to the middle. Like it's not I'm going to pick at the edge. It's like I'm going all in, right? And that visual the reason why, like how I kind of thought about it this year when I got that visual on the buck in Kansas was, and I was trying to think about it, right? Because how would I explain it, or like its importance, or, I guess just explain it in general. And as deer hunters, whether we realize we do it like consciously or subconsciously, we're always making hypotheses about what we think the deer are doing, right? And different guys will have different levels of confidence in their hypothesis, right? But still, at the end of the day, it's in a hypothesis, right? Until they actually kill that deer in that spot or whatever the case is. And to me, the way I kind of look at the visual is that it dispels, it either proves hypotheses wrong or it confirms the hypothesis is correct, right? Either way, right. And being wrong and knowing that you're wrong is just as good as knowing that you're right, because it allows you to have like a piece of actual real information that is not that's not in question. It's a fact, right? And that to me is kind of what the visual does for me. And I almost feel like, again, it's time of year dependent, right? How long that piece of truth holds up is somewhat time of year dependent, right? So for example, for me, the Kansas visual that I got, I knew just from, and this is where your hunting intuition and just like your experience has to come into play. I knew that time of year, the way that deer was acting and being with a doe and knowing where he was bedded, but couldn't see him where he was bedded. I was trying to glass him and find him. I knew that there was probably a 2-day window of him being consistent with that doe, bedding with that doe before he got aggressive and cut her out. So I knew that
Sure.
piece of truth that I had was like, I need to kill him now. I was like, because it's not going to be the same truth in two more days, because he's likely going to lock down with her and cut her out somewhere, and who knows where he's going to be. And it'll be 5 days until he comes off of her and comes back, becomes visible, or becomes super visible again, right? And so, but the truth, during late season, you might have a longer runway, right? Because now they're not chasing does, right? You have a visual on a deer. He's probably bedded pretty consistent based on like a hidey hole he got pushed into from gun pressure, and relative to where a food source for that time of year might be.
Yep.
And so now, instead of having like a 2-day window, you might be able to play that cat and mouse game for 2-3 weeks and be able to kind of pick the exact wind condition that you need to kind of get in there, right? That kind of pre-rut and rut time frame, it's like you got to kind of sometimes roll the dice on the wind, because you're only going to get that piece of truth for but a couple of days, and it's got to happen, and so you can't wait for the exact right wind. You got to kind of make the wind right. And that to me is almost, I think to me is one of the biggest benefits of hunting from the ground, is because I can actually get away with a lot more wind directions than I can whenever I'm in a tree. I feel like, I don't know if there's any truth to that or not, but I just feel like I can beat the wind a lot more on the ground than I can in a tree, or I can get set up in specific spots that allow me to cut the wind more the way I want to, versus the way like the single tree that has the best shot opportunity may not be positioned exactly right, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the things that you highlighted on, I think, is like understand the time of the year that you're hunting the animal and what are the patterns during that time of the year, and change your game accordingly. Late season is obviously different than hunting during the pre-rut or the rut, and so it does go back to that whole thing of us as hunters. How are you patterned as a hunter? What is your default mode? I was coaching the other day. The kids were doing just drilling, and I'm watching them drill, and it's a mixed bag of experienced and non-experienced kids. And when you're first starting to learn the sport of wrestling or jiu-jitsu, a lot of things are just move based. It's very mechanical. You're hitting a single leg and then you're taking the kid down. You might have been taught a setup, but they're all very separate. And so I was talking to him. I said, hey, if anyone asked you what is your go-to setup and what is your go-to takedown, could you just rattle that off right away? And I went over some explanation on what I like to do and said, you need to be thinking about this when you're drilling. And then as you grow in your knowledge, you're going to have a number 2 setup, takedown, a number 3, another 4, a number 5, to your point, because as you go, like you're out in Kansas, you're hunting in a different environment against a different age class buck. That's a different animal, right? It's a different time of the year than what your early season buck is, right? So you got different animal, different age class, different pattern. That thing definitely behaves differently than what the buck is you shot in the early season. And so now, if you think about it as a hunter, if you are only used to hunting under a specific location, specific topography, under a certain time of the year, and you haven't forced yourself to hunt some late seasons, to hunt some early seasons, to hunt some swamps, to hunt some hill country, to hunt some islands on a kayak, when you get in that situation at potentially shooting a booner animal, are you going to be able to react? Have you given yourself, and that doesn't mean that you have to have success. It just means that you have had experience putting yourself through that situation. So you've thought through your head, like, hey, when the time comes, those things are going to fire off in my head. You're going to move to the ground and adjust your position. The things that you said, knowing that you were only going to have a 2-day time window and that buck is probably going to be with that doe for 5 days, and then it's going to move on or lock her down or kick her out. Obviously, you've spent a lot of time thinking about how they behave during that time of the year. If you're someone who hasn't really thought about that, again, that's something you're going to be at a disadvantage in that situation.
Right? Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things, I think, going back to what you said earlier, when we first started chatting, was just around reflection, right? Like, don't necessarily make New Year's resolutions, and either do I, but it's more of a reflection of like what went right this year, what went wrong, how could things be a little bit better, whatever the case is. I think that honesty with yourself of like, what is the gap that I need to close, or like the most obvious gap I need to close, to be better. And it whatever it happens to be. And like, I literally had this conversation with my coach last night. I got promoted, in September to a blue belt, and it's been a couple months, and I've been, working on stuff and playing with a bunch of different things. And I actually have a private lesson coming up with him at some point that I have to schedule. And that's where I just go in and spend like an hour or a little more than an hour with him. And I go over like a part of my game that I want to develop. I want some tools for a specific spot that either is giving me trouble, or tools for a specific spot that like has become like the thing that I'm recognizing as my go-to. And I want to like tighten up those techniques and just make them more ironclad. And I'm always a person, going back to the reflection piece of, I seek feedback all the time. Like, I want to know, even whether it's work, whether it's hunting, whether it's jiu-jitsu, whatever it is, I want to know the areas from someone else's perspective where I need to grow or where I need to get better, and see if they map to like what I kind of recognize. Like, how honest am I with myself in my evaluation versus what someone else is seeing from the outside. And so I just, knowing that I have a private coming up, I was just like, hey, what do you expect from me? As a person who is under your tutelage, right? Learning from you,
right,
at where I'm at in my journey. Like, what is your expectation for me to advance on like specific skill sets and things like that, right? And his response was he was like, continue to play in all positions, and explore, is one thing that you're doing that you should continue doing. And the other one is I want to see you start to develop like a game, like things that you can go to, like things that are like clearly whenever you roll, someone could watch you and identify that you have a specific kind of systematic way that you like to do things, right? Like, whether it's like he likes to take the back, or whether he's really good with, leg entanglements or whatever happens to be, he's like, start to develop that. He's like, and then, start focusing on submission rate increase, right? Like, ending more rounds with submissions and stuff like that. Not that I do it at the expense of like playing and learning, but like really starting to tighten up like my go-to submissions and stuff like that, right? And so it's not really any different as a deer hunter. Like, you should be looking at your approach to things and go, where am I deficient? And even ask a hunting buddy, like, where am I deficient? Like, where are my blind spots? What am I not seeing? What do I need to get better at? And I knew for me, like, ground hunting was one of the things I wanted to get better at. And what I didn't realize was how much better it was going to make me at everything else, and then just forcing myself to kind of look at things differently, hunt a different caliber of animal, a different maturity of animal in different kind of scenarios is all the stuff that you're talking about. It's like, that's how you kind of force that growth. In sports, you kind of like assess and then drill. In hunting, you kind of observe and put yourself in situations that you've maybe not been in before to expand like your vocabulary, if you will.
Yeah. You see this when you coach. If you coach young athletes, you'll see this a lot with certain physical attributes if they're successful young. Like, okay, if you take any of the sports, if you're bigger, faster, stronger at a younger age, in a lot of cases, you will experience success without necessarily learning proper technique or proper discipline around the mechanics of said sport, because your physical attributes put you above the rest of the competition. Now what I've seen, and this isn't universal, but I've seen a lot of cases of it, is as that person gets older, they often it becomes very mentally draining for them as other people's physical attributes start to match theirs, right?
Yeah.
Because they never were forced to be disciplined around the mechanics of the sport or the technique because their physical attributes are so much better. So they learned bad habits. This happens all the time with wrestling. I've seen it with soccer. Like, if they're physically faster or stronger, they don't learn the ball mastery or the foot skills. And then they get to a certain age or level of competition when it's all about ball mastery or foot skills. Wrestling's the same way, jiu-jitsu is the same way. You will get to a certain level where if you don't have the necessary basics around the technique, then it doesn't, you're going to run into someone that's just as strong as you and stronger, and you're not going to be able to move that wall,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I was going to say the basics of the techniques is so accurate, because I think one of the things and I think we're all guilty of this at different points in our hunting journey, is that, we start to look for, like, just for lack of a better way to say it, the fun or fancy, flashy, approaches to things, because they're fun, they're interesting, they're unique, and they might result in success once in a while. Same thing in grappling, jiu-jitsu, football. Like, the highlight catch in football is always amazing, right? But it's that consistent, it's that wide receiver that is always open on third down to convert, is the guy who is worth gold, And it's similar in jiu-jitsu. It's like, Roger Gracie won like 5 world titles, and it's when they interview him about it, he literally talks about this, that he won 5 world titles with the stuff you learn as a white belt in the first month that you start training. Like, that's like, and he was just like, he mastered those things so well that even though you knew exactly what he was going to do, he could still do it because he was just so technically sound at it, And that's a little bit of he's a master, right? So it's a little bit of a stretch, but the point being is that he's not doing anything fancy. It's meat and potatoes, but he just does it so well. And I think a lot of times we get away from that in hunting, where, we overcomplicate things because we feel like it should be more complicated when sometimes it's not, and we want to go with the flashy thing where it's like, at the end of the day, if you're a new hunter, if you learn how the food rotates in your area, like during different times of year, if you learn how to play the wind, you learn how to appropriately kind of assess and utilize access and exit strategies to keep areas clean. And you learn the basics of how to read sign. Like, you don't have to be a master at it, but you can like decipher rubs, and if it's a decent deer and not a good deer, the quality of a scrape during a particular time of year. Like, if you do those handful of things, man, like, you're going to be in really good shape as a deer hunter, And then if you want to get into all the other stuff, then cool. But it's the guys that consistently do those fundamental things really, really well are the guys that are filling tags most consistently.
Yeah. You said the word consistent in that in your statement like 4 times, and that's the thing. Consistence around the basics that you're going to be successful with, and it's hunting very much falls within that. and it's difficult to not get caught up in the trap. I think for me, part of the fun is now like you know, talking to other friends and I see this, we talked about Joe, Joe and I have a lot of conversations about different
Mm-hmm.
tactics and different areas to hunt. But what I see with someone like Joe is that his passion meets his consistent effort on a daily
Mm-hmm.
basis to not only think, but put stuff into practice to go out and scout and figure out what these animals are doing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so someone looking for success and seeing what that is. I mean, you will find that pattern common in people that have success in everything, right? So their passion for it is matching their behavior or their activities that they're doing every day, right? And so then they get more excited about it. I mean, um, that book that I mentioned before, that Achieving the
Mm-hmm.
Impossible book, talks about that. They get a dopamine hit, you get excited about it. Then you're building pathways in your brain, and then you're learning new things. So consistency is big in hunting and forcing
Yeah.
yourself to learn some new stuff. It doesn't have to be rocket science.
Yeah.
It's just
No.
get
I
out there
think.
and
Yeah,
yeah,
I think the simpler you keep it, the better. Like that was the one thing. I was talking to buddies, about that Kansas buck, and yeah, I told some buddies texted me after that night that I glassed him, and they asked me if I'd seen anything, and I said no. And my one buddy was like, "Why'd you say that?" And I was like, "Because I didn't want to talk about it." I was like, I knew what I needed to do to kill the deer, and I didn't need any suggestions. I was like, I
yeah,
didn't need to overcomplicate this. I saw him do A. Pretty sure he's going to do B tomorrow, and if he does B tomorrow, I'll kill him. I was like, it was as simple as that. And I could have made that thing way more complicated than it needed to be and screwed it up. But it was just take it. Sometimes just take things at face value is
right.
the way to go.
And that was similar with my buck that I shot off the ground as well. Ironically, that area, one of the cool things that I observed this year, and we know deer travel a long
Mm-hmm.
way during pre-rut, rut, they start to begin to travel. So I've been observing, literally two different bedding areas that are almost, as the crow flies, like a mile and a half apart from each other. And what was interesting to me about some of these bucks is that uh, they for sure started traveling during the pre-rut and rut, that full, you know, 2.5 mile loop that would get them sweeping past those two
Mm-hmm.
bedding areas, right? Bedding to the north and then traveling to the south to check on doe and then making that whole big loop cycle again. Um, and throughout the year, I was trying to access certain areas to get them coming out of the bedding to the north, and then I knew that they would shift and they'd be bedding to the south, so I would try to, access them there. What's interesting about this one spot that formed in the south, so there's two things, like the topography actually changed enough this year to create something that I'd never seen before. I mean, you know how you hear about that there will be a an area where doe will come specifically to be bred, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
it's, bucks will cruise the downwind side of it, and I've never actually observed that. I've
Mm-hmm.
seen bucks cruise the downwind side of areas, you sit in funnels, but I've never actually observed an area where does came to breed. Well, this particular spot, um, I observed that on stand this year,
Hmm.
actually the night before I killed my buck. And when I came into the area the first time, I actually had a couple doe get up right on the fringe of the swamp from the island, get up out of bedding, and I bumped them essentially, right? And I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, ah, crap, that sucks. So they were in tight to the spot I was trying to hunt. Well, I get set up. As I was getting set up, one buck already started trying to come into the area, and he spooked because he saw me moving as I was getting set up. And then about 30 minutes later, a doe got up out of the core bedding area, and she immediately, when she stood up, put her tail up and started flagging
Mm-hmm.
and twisting her head around. And it literally took her probably about 35 minutes to walk from where she was bedded, which was maybe 50 yards off the island I was on, to the island I was on. When she got on the island, she continued that same behavior. She would walk a little bit, 5, 10 steps, raise her tail, scan the area, squat down, and like present that she wanted to be bred, and continue to just like do this. Well, I had I had another buck come in, um, unfortunately to my downwind side shoulder, and I knew like she instantly locked on him as he was coming to my downwind side right shoulder. And I'm like, well, this is going to play out two ways. He's going to get to my windstream and bust me and blow out, or there's going to be a slight chance that, because she was only 20 yards in front of me, that he's going to actually curl around and walk past me, and I'm going to get a shot at him. So I'm watching her, and I'm just sitting there like this over my right shoulder, just waiting. And I could tell, like, I could hear once he got out of the swamp and he was actually getting onto this little island. And sure enough, he came just close enough where I could see like the left side of his main beam, and he turned and kind of gave me an eyeball, caught my thermals, and went. So I didn't really see how big or what he was, which is probably better. He's probably some monster, and I didn't want to know that anyways, because it was going to be very difficult for me in that situation that he wasn't going to win me and wrap around.
Right.
But then that particular area was like, those other two doe were bedded close by. This doe literally was in the end of this island, sitting there waiting for a buck to come and breed her, right? And those bucks, so the other interesting thing, while all that's going on, I literally had another buck, probably 75 to 80 yards away, that was tending a doe just off the edge of the island in the swamp. So I could hear him, I could see the doe, and I caught him moving in his rack, moving in and out. I thought he was actually going to come to the edge of the island. And some people might ask, well, Mario, why weren't you more set up on the edge? Why didn't you get into the swamp? I mean, yes, I do that. And yes, those areas are like, if I do that, it's kind of like one of those all or nothing moves, because what I've found is you go in there and then they bust out and they don't. So what was cool is I actually observed an area where doe were coming to, specifically where they knew bucks would come and breed them. And I never observed that live on a stand before. So that was pretty cool. So anyways, that leads me to how I ended up shooting this buck. It was like, well, the wind was going to be very...
Is this the same day? Or is this the next day that you killed the buck?
Everything that I killed him on the next day, but all of what I'm describing now with the buck tending a doe in the swamp, and this other one walking up on me, and the other one coming in while I was setting up, that all happened during the same series that was the same hunt.
Right.
That all happened
during
the same afternoon.
Was that first hunt also on the ground?
No, I was in my stand. I was in my stand observing the one that came in while I was setting up, and the doe that came in that was presenting, and then the other buck that was tending that doe. That was while I was all on stand. The wind was going to be very similar, and I have to walk pretty far to get back to this spot. And I'm like, well, I want to get in here really early in the morning, the next day. So I'm like, at times I will leave my setup in there and then just sneak in the morning. A lot of times I shift, but for this location, I'm like, well, the wind's going to be fairly similar. I can make this work because they'll be coming from the opposite direction in the morning, and yada, yada, yada. So I leave my stand and sticks set up in here, and I sneak out. I loop all the way around out of there, and then get up the next morning, and as I get onto this island, and as I'm approaching, I'm like, this wind is really squirrely and it's not doing what I want it to do. So then I start thinking, I'm gonna have to set up on the ground. So the other thing about this with topography changes is that this is an oak island an oak island that is up against a swamp. In the past, it had been relatively open, meaning once you got onto the island, you had a mix of oaks and maples, but you could see across the island. Now, in the last 5 years, that's completely changed on this end that I was hunting. So where I was hunting the day before, it's a small little cove that's probably open cove that's probably 20 yards by 50 yards, and it's completely shrouded by this small buckthorn forest that's grown up that's like 15, 16 feet tall. So it's literally like all, you know, 1 inch to 4 inch buckthorn trees that are just jammed together in a tight thicket. And it creates this whole protective cove on the backside of this island that then is adjacent to cattails and swamp and dogwood that provides bedding. So again, these doe are coming to this spot in the island that you can't see with the naked eye through the buckthorn, and they're in this open area waiting to be bred. So in the morning, when I decided to set up on the ground, I knew that there was a large scrape on the north side of that thicket. So not in where the cove is, but there was a scrape on the north side of the thicket. So if you could imagine, bucks would come in from the south side and the north side, depending on how the wind was, and they would go in and check this scrape. Then they would traverse through the buckthorn into that cove. Like those bucks that were coming in the day before, they were actually wrapping around the back side of the island and just hitting there was a corridor through the buckthorn that they were walking through to enter into that cove to check if there were does there. And bucks would go in there to fight. I had a camera up in there because I'd never gone back in there and hunted before. So anyways, I decided to set up on the north side of this, just off from where the scrape was, but where the wind was to my advantage. So there was like a crosswind that was blowing. I literally just chose, when I first sat down, I kind of looked around because I sat in this pile of down brush, and I'm like, it's too open here. Like my backside is exposed. I can't really move really comfortably. And so I looked over, and there was a large tree that had another tree like fallen down just next to it. So I literally got up. I said, no, don't be complacent or lazy. Go get set up in the right spot. So I slid over and just like literally hunched down and dropped where this tree trunk that was probably, 4 feet wide of a large oak tree that was growing. And then there was a dead ash that was falling down on the edge of it. And at around, it was like 7:15, I had a little spike-horn buck literally chase a doe for 3 circles. So they busted out of the swamp, went into the buckthorn, into the cove, circled back around, and they were running past me at like 10 yards. So I was sitting on the ground, and they're just running past me. The doe actually on the third loop, she made a turn and wanted to jump over the log that I was like leaning up against, and she kind of ran straight towards me, saw me, and then busted and turned. And that little spike-horn, he had other things on his mind, so he just like ran past it like 5 yards. So it was funny. I was thinking to myself, because again, I'm like, well, I saw a buck like I wanted to, but I'm saying to the deer gods, well, it would be nice if I saw something that was a little bigger than that,
Right.
And literally not 10 minutes later, 10, 15 minutes later, I was kind of futzing around with my bow or something, and I look up, and it's like I see that 11 pointer like coming. I didn't know at the time what buck it was, but coming out of the buckthorn, and all of a sudden it's like right there at 20 yards in front of me. And again, coming from the cove through the buckthorn to the area where that scrape was. And so I had to make a decision, like a split decision, like, oh, that's a nice looking buck. Okay, I need to get my sight on him. And he literally went from 20 yards to 15 yards and walked right past me. Didn't have a single clue. The wind was to my advantage. Didn't have any idea I was sitting there. Walked right past broadside, and I watched the arrow go right behind his front shoulder, and he ran off to the front of the island and ended up crashing like 75 yards away, never made it off a large island back into the swamp. Um, and that particular buck, what was super interesting is when I look back through camera pictures, the only other time I had that buck on camera was almost a mile and a half, 2 miles north. So that buck was going through that particular bedding area to check if there was any does to breed, and he, quite frankly, was on the back end of his loop, right? If I had to guess, that buck was on its way back north to check the bedding areas that are between that south bedding area and where he goes to bed at night, right? Where he was living all year. Coming back late because it's that time of the year, and yeah, I caught him. So
it's always nice when you can hear them crash. That's for sure.
Yeah.
So in that moment, did you know you were like, oh, it's a dead deer? Or did you have that normal, hunter anxiety of like, immediately you're like, oh, that's a dead deer. And then you're like, oh man, did I hit him with where I think I hit him? Like, cause that happens to me every time.
Yeah. I had the normal anxiety. Like, right. I mean, I was, because you're on the ground, and the trajectory of how your arrow goes, like, I didn't have immediate confirmation because I couldn't see, where my arrow had landed. Typically the times, because I've shot in 2 bucks off the ground like that, and the arrow just goes because you're shooting flat or it's slightly up, and the arrow hit and skip, and it's never where
Yeah.
I didn't find this arrow,
right.
But
right.
I hit him, I double lunged him, and it's not until I got up and I started like tracking the blood, and then it was, and I'm partially colorblind, so even if there's a lot of blood, it's like, okay, yeah, there's a little bit of red, right. Once it starts getting more and more heavy, then I was more confident that this thing was dead laying over there. Yeah.
Right. What's cool about that hunt is, like, we've been talking a lot about breaking patterns just in general, right? And you broke a pattern to kill that deer because your pattern was going to be to get back into that tree again when you got there. And for people out there listening, like, that's what we're talking about. Like, breaking patterns doesn't mean you have to wholesale change like an area or whatever. It can be the simple things of, you made a plan, you got there, the plan doesn't feel quite right. If you're first, like, Occam's razor, right? Like, the simplest solution is usually the correct solution, right? And so for deer hunting, it's like when you walk into a spot and you immediately think something, it just comes to you. That's usually probably the thing you should be focused. And like, people will say, this guy has a sixth sense, or this guy has like this intuition. I think everybody does to a degree. I think it becomes stronger as you hunt more often, or as you get longer in your hunting journey. But the difference between them and like maybe someone newer is that they've learned to trust that feeling, right? And that's like, to me, like the biggest thing. Like, whenever I think of guys like you or Dan, or an Andy May or something like that, it's like, people, well, what's the secret sauce? I'm like, the secret sauce is they've done it so much that whenever they get that intuition, they listen to it. As opposed to like someone new, it's like you start to second guess yourself and talk yourself out of a good situation.
Yeah, and the sensitivity of these areas, someone might ask, well, why didn't you just pull your stand the night before? I mean,
right.
If I'm being completely honest, during that time of the year, when you're at it hard and you're moving, like in some of these spots, I'm in decent shape, but I'm still not the youngest spring chicken in the world. So It's like, you get tired. Like, it becomes, when you're doing it night and day and you're popping into these different spots, like, I'll admit it, like, you get a little bit burnt out of wanting to be able to quietly set up and get all your gear set up, in the morning and in the night. So part of what went through my mind that evening when I had everything set is like, well, I'll be able to slip in here and be a lot more quiet and do it much more efficiently if I just leave my set. but then as I started going into there, the things that popped into my head, I was like, well, what if there's doe bedded around that backside again?
Mm-hmm.
Then I'm going to bump them.
Yeah.
What if there's a buck bedded nearby around that backside that's monitoring the cove? And if I slide in there with the way that this wind is, because it's shifting around, I'm going to blow it out.
Right.
Not to say
Yeah.
that something else might not run in there. So then all these things started popping into my head on the fly. And then I was like, I can literally slide in here like with my headlamp off because I know where I need to walk and not make any sound and just tuck up against this tree.
Mm-hmm.
The wind to my advantage. None of my scent will get over there.
Yeah.
And it worked.
And it worked. Yeah.
It worked.
At the end of the day, you're a genius because it worked.
Yeah. If it didn't work, then it would just be a story I was telling. It was like, well, it was a theory. Yeah.
Right. That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, that to me is like one of the benefits of just, being able to hunt a bunch of different ways, whether it's from the ground and just being able to use different approaches, but also identifying, maybe even more so, being able to identify when a new approach is required. Whether it's even when it gets down to like, should I call? Should I not call? Should I grunt? Should I not grunt? Should I snort wheeze? Not snort wheeze? Should I rattle? Should I not rattle? Like all those things, you just learn over time from doing them, making the mistakes, and reading the situation, like whether what it's going to call for. Like for me this year, probably the smartest thing I did all year, to be honest with you, was I was using a decoy while I was in Kansas, and I decoyed one young buck into like whatever it was, like 5 or 7 yards, and I did it just to practice because I could see him coming like from 50, 60 yards out, and I was like, there weren't any other deer with him, and honestly, I didn't want him around me too awful long because I didn't want him blowing up my spot, So I was like, let me decoy him and I'll play with him and see what I can get away with, what I can't get away with, just kind of like as practice. And, got him to like 5, 7 yards, and he spent probably, 5 minutes, like just bewildered. Like he was not sure. He was like, I don't know what that thing is. He's just looking at it, and I'm moving around it because I just have it on like a stake and it's a heads up decoy, and I'm just moving it, and I'm moving around it behind it. So he could see me moving, but he just wasn't sure what I was. And I think he more so thought that I was probably part of the deer moving, but the smartest thing I did when I ended up killing that deer was I had the decoy with me, and there was a split second where I thought about flashing the decoy to try to get his attention, like to try to draw him in a little closer. But the smartest thing I did was not pick that thing up because, the does kind of walked behind me and down this fence row, and he's standing at the corner like this CRP in this cut bean field, and I'm tucked under these trees. And part of me was like, is he going to blow out of here? What's he going to do? And I was like, well, if I flash the decoy, it gives him something to fixate on, and maybe I can just hold him here, and then maybe he makes a good decision for me, wants to come check it out or whatever. But in the back of my mind, I was like, it was jiu-jitsu saying, really. It was let him kill himself the way he wants to be killed. It's like, don't force him, what I mean? Let him do it himself, And I never picked it up. And that was probably the smartest thing I did on that whole trip, was just not pick up that decoy. Because I truly think if I would have not knew what approach to use in that moment, of like observing deer in that area, having decoyed a deer, earlier that day, just to kind of watch how they react and stuff like that. Like I probably would have picked it up. But in the back of my mind, I was like, you shouldn't introduce a human intrusion into their experience to break their pattern unless it's the last kind of like ditch effort, in my opinion. So whether it's calling or whatever the case is, let them be deer until you kind of like without a doubt know that unless I do something, this thing, like the opportunity is going to dissipate. And then it's neither here nor there, right? It's like he was either going to walk out of your life and you weren't going to get the shot, or you threw whatever you needed to throw at him to try to get him to do what you needed him to do, and you still didn't get the shot. So it all ended up the same way anyway, and so I think that's probably the smartest thing I did on that whole trip. And it was like one of the things that I learned that I'll take with me beyond that hunt, which was just being way more mindful of when those things are appropriate, and more often than not, let the deer do the deer thing. And you'll probably get the shot anyway, is what, like when you talk to guys that do this stuff, it's like they'll often get the shot anyway, even if they don't introduce. And more times than not, introducing something goes wrong, essentially.
So if I might ask, like that, that's a massive buck. So how did you keep, like, how far away were you when you had to draw on them, and how did you keep cool in that situation when you knew?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the first time I laid eyes on him, he was, obviously it was the day before because I glassed him from like 0.8 of a mile away. But the day of, like when I actually killed him, the doe popped out next to me, and I saw the first doe. He was with 2 does the night before, and I saw the first doe, and she was at like 7 yards, and it was, I didn't see her until it was like almost like I would have liked to have seen her way earlier because she got way too close too quick. And she almost blew my cover, and there was a second doe with her. And that's the tricky part in plain states during that time of year. You're usually not beating just the buck. It's like you're usually having to beat a buck and a couple does, at the same time. And so I had 6 eyes and 6 ears and 3 noses that I was trying to beat, you know? And so I saw him, once I saw the second doe, I realized that was them, and he was going to be coming. And then when I first saw him, he was probably like 50 yards out. And I just saw a huge rack. I didn't know how big he was at the time. I just knew he was a big deer. And immediately, I mean, what you would think, like my throat or my heart jumped into my throat immediately, and started kind of coming unglued a little bit. And I just remember saying to myself, it was the weirdest thing because you'll hear about guys that go on autopilot or they black out whenever they take a shot or, whenever this stuff happens. And I just remember saying to myself, literally, I mumbled it to myself. Like I was like, get your shit together and kill this deer. Calm down, you know? Yeah. And Jake asked me the same question. And what I said was, and people, may or may not like the answer or believe the answer or whatever, but honestly, I attribute it to just like jiu-jitsu practice of understanding that like being in control of the moment and being able to calm yourself is the way you work out of bad situations. It's never losing your mind, and freaking out and spazzing. It usually gets you in a worse position because there's always a solution, whether or not you're skilled enough in your journey in jiu-jitsu or whatever to recognize the answers, but there's always an answer and a response to whatever someone's doing to you, And that's when I literally said to myself, I was like, calm down, get your shit together and kill this deer. And then immediately I was like, I was going to pick up the decoy. And I remember saying to myself, kill him how he wants to be killed. He's going to let you kill him. Just let him show you how, essentially. And so there was a bunch of stuff in this tree. I was on my knees, and there was a cedar tree right in front of me and a locust tree kind of off to my left, right behind that small cedar tree. And I was tucked underneath a locust tree. And there was a big ball of stuff that was in this locust tree. And whenever those does kind of came behind me, he stood at the corner at that where the CRP kind of met this cut bean field in that corner, and he was about 40 yards away, and he's just like looking in where I'm at, like looking directly at me, like having a stare off. He can't see me. I'm in a ghillie jacket tucked in, but he's just looking in that direction. And I'm just waiting for him to make the turn. And I knew if he broke to his right, my left, go down that fence row where those does went, like there was 2 posts, and one was at 30 yards and one was 29, and in between was like 27 to 26 yards. And I knew if he broke that way, my opportunity to draw was going to be when his head was behind that stuff in the tree. That was going to be my opportunity to draw. And so he stood there for a second. We had a stare off, and I was kind of ready. And as soon as he turned to come down, he put his head behind that stuff, and that's when I drew back. And he walked, and he hit. Nice. He was giving me a completely broadside shot, and I mouth bleeded him when he got in between those posts, and he stopped, but he hit my scent trail at the same time because that's exactly where my scent was blowing. And when he hit that, instead of being completely broadside, he didn't just turn his head, but he jerked his whole body like to the left, and went from a broadside shot to a quartering 2 shot. And I just remember like I was floating the pin center mass of his vitals, and as soon as he turned, like I didn't freak out. Like I remember everything, like how he turned. I just moved it to the front shoulder, and I was like, just pull your shot through. And I didn't rush the shot. I just held it there. I held it there probably longer than most people probably would have. Like I held it, and just let it float until like the shot broke and it buried. And he jumped, ran, and he fell down a couple times and jumped into the CRP. And the long story short is I wasn't sure. Like I saw the arrow bury. It was getting close to dark, and so I had to go find the arrow, try to, but to your point, when you shoot from the ground, a lot of times you don't find that arrow, especially in CRP, because it was all CRP that he was walking through. And I knew it was getting dark, and I wanted to at least find blood. And so I found where he was in that bean field. The blood just looked like mud, so I couldn't tell what kind of blood I had. And I walked over to that CRP field, and I was concerned with the hit just by the way he was falling, because he kept hitting the ground, jump up, hit the ground, jump up, hit the ground, like falling on his face, just like straight bulldozing, Right. And I got over to the edge of that CRP, and I gave him like 15, 20 minutes until I walked to check my arrow, because I was like, let him maybe get out of eyesight and earshot. And I walked over there, and he was, end of the day, like I smoked him, but I didn't realize at the time. When I walked over to the edge of that CRP, followed his blood trail to that, because I was literally just going to mark it and walk out. That was my plan. I was like,
sure.
Or I was like, I'm going to mark where he walked into the CRP, so I'm not trying to find like dried up blood in the dirt or in the dry Kansas ground again. So I at least know where he entered the CRP. So if I need to get a dog, I know at least where to start. And as soon as I got over to the edge of the CRP, he was laying in there like 5 feet and jumped up in front of me and like jumped. Yeah. And like jumped 3 jumps and hit the ground, like bulldozed his face right into the ground again. I walked into about, I don't know, probably like within 15 yards of him, and I could see his rack in the grass, and I could see, I was just guessing where his body was at, and I knocked an arrow and shot one over his back, and he jumped up, took 2 jumps and face planted again, and I got a little closer, and he jumped up like one more time and face planted again. And this time then I walked, like snuck into him to about 5 yards and shot it, put one in his back rib, and that was it. So it was crazy, like how it all kind of ended.
Yeah.
Moral of the story was that first arrow killed him. Like whenever I took him to the taxidermist, we caped him out, and that arrow went through both shoulders. It was just laying against the hide on the offside shoulder, like it blew through both shoulders, just didn't make it through the hide.
Sure.
And so, I mean, if I would have had a little bit more daylight and would have sat there for probably 30 minutes, he was going to die. And the guy was like, he's like, I can't believe he made it as long as he did, So where I bumped him out of that CRP right along the edge, like he was laying down to die there. And if I would have given him probably like another 10 minutes, he probably would have been done.
Yeah.
But I was losing light.
Able get it.
Yeah. But I was losing light, and I was like, I need to figure out what kind of hit I have. I was like, so I need to at least know that. And it just was fortunate or unfortunate, whichever, that he was laying that close to the edge, Fortunate because it ended up the way it did, but it would have been unfortunate had he run off.
Well, yeah, and knowing where he accessed and trying to get a little intel on that if you're going to come the next day and track, because we had that, you got here where there's dry leaves and that blood, you got nice pools of blood. And before you get back in there the next day and those leaves suck all that blood up, and then you're kind of, you're chasing a ghost at that point. But
and that's what I did.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's what I didn't want to have happen, was chase a ghost. So I was like, let's just end it here, before it gets too Western. This is Western enough for me. It was like, but awesome, man. Well, buddy, I'm glad to be able to chat with you, dude. You're always one of my favorite people to talk to. We talked a little bow hunting, we talked a little grappling, a little jiu-jitsu, a little wrestling. But I know it's we've been chopping it up for about an hour and a half. I want to be sensitive to your time. And speaking of jiu-jitsu and grappling, I'm going to actually head to another gym today for an open mat to go roll with a bunch of new people I've never rolled with before.
Very nice.
As you know, it's like I'm getting out of my comfort zone. I'm breaking my pattern, as we've been talking about.
It is. Yeah. Yes, it will be. I'm sure you're thinking in your head right now, like, what is this going to be like? It's always uncomfortable when you go roll with new people, because you don't know how.
Well, these noon classes too are always chocked full of like, and it's just an open mat, so it's not a class, but like a handful of the guys at my gym are going down. It's actually where my coach got his black belt. It was like his instructor, where he trained, like all his upbringing or whatever. Even when he was fighting in MMA and stuff like that, was where he trained. And so a couple guys are going down from the gym because they have off work today for the holiday weekend and stuff. And so there's like a group of like 5 of us going down to the city to train there. And these noon classes are always kind of like chocked full of, black belts and brown belts and stuff like that. So I'm probably going to be the low man on the totem pole there and just basically take a thrashing for 2 hours, but that's how you get better. So whatever.
Yeah, it's all good. It's all good.
Awesome, man. Before I let you get out of here, though, buddy, let me know, or let people know where they can find out more about you, where they can find out, all the stuff that Hunting Beast has going on too.
Yeah, most of the stuff you could find. I mean, we have a Honeybees forum that's on Facebook. Obviously, we have Honeybees gear, selling our tree stands and climbing sticks. We have a Facebook page and following for that. Dan does a live podcast on Tuesday nights through the Hunting Beast, so he often has guests on there, or they'll just talk about current topics that are going on in hunting. They take live questions from the guests that come on there and anyone that logs on, so that's a good source as well. Um, yeah, I've got Instagram account mtraf jr, but I don't post too much to that. Most of my stuff just goes straight through like the Hunting Beast and social media like that. If you need to contact me about anything else, info@huntingbeastgear.com. You can send me an email through there. So yeah,
Awesome.
thank you for having me on again. It's always fun talking to you.
Yeah, man. We'll definitely catch up. We got to make this a recurring thing, especially as we get into the NCAA tournament and these guys get some more matches under their belt and so forth. I am going to the Escape the Rock tournament. It's because it's not too far from where I live, so I know you know what that is, but people listening, it's just probably one of the top 5 like high school wrestling tournaments in the country. It's like a lot of eventual national champions come through that tournament. So I'm going to go there with one of the guys I train with. He's a former D1 wrestler, so he's into wrestling as much as I am. So we're going to go watch some top level high school kids get after it. So I'll keep you informed as I'm watching that unfold. Let you know how it's shaking out.
Sounds good.
All right, buddy.
Well, take care.
All right, folks, that is a wrap for today's show. I'd like to thank all of you for listening, and if you haven't yet, please head over to iTunes and leave us a 5-star rating, and be sure to subscribe to the podcast. And while you're at it, head over to YouTube and give us a sub there as well. I'd be super appreciative if you do those couple things for me. And before I shut this thing down, we need to give a big shout out to our partners who continue to help us make this podcast possible. Tethered, Exodus Outdoor Gear, and Genesee Beer. And until next time, we'll see y'all.